experiencing decompression in outer space with less than 20 seconds to react. 3 men, 1 capsule, and a tiny valve that no one noticed, until it was too late. What began as the Soviet Union's moment of greatest pride ended in an inexplicable silence. When the recovery team opened the capsule door, they found something they would never be able to forget for the rest of their lives. This is the most harrowing tragedy to ever occur in space, and almost no one talks about it. In June 1971, the Soviet Union was under pressure. 2 years earlier, the United States had landed a man on the moon. The Soviet Union had lost the most prestigious race in human history, and they could not let that happen twice. The answer was Salyut 1, the first space station ever built by humans. Not just going to space, not just orbiting, but actually living there for weeks, conducting experiments, proving that humans could live beyond Earth. The Soyuz 11 mission was chosen to make that a reality. But there was a problem that was never made public. The original crew, who had trained for months, was suddenly disqualified 4 days before launch. One of its members was suspected of having tuberculosis. There was no time for a deep investigation, no time for long deliberations. The backup crew was swapped in immediately. Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, Viktor Patsayev, the only one who had been to space before. And precisely because of that, he became a problem. Volkov felt more experienced, more knowledgeable, and he didn't hesitate to show it. Tensions between Volkov and Dobrovolsky began even before they left Earth. But no one canceled the launch. On June 6, 1971, Soyuz 11 launched into the sky, and the world applauded. The 3 men successfully docked with Salyut 1 and began life in the first space station in history. On paper, everything went according to plan. The reality was much more complicated. On June 16th, 10 days after launch, an electrical fire broke out on Salyut 1. The fire was extinguished, but the damage was done. The station switched to backup power. Ground control in Moscow declared the situation safe and ordered the mission to continue. But the cosmonauts were not convinced. They asked to return home early. Ground control refused. Ground control still said no. The following weeks became a brutal mental test. Stress accumulated. Sleep was never enough. Volkov, who was supposed to be the most experienced, began showing worrying signs. Irritable, starting to make small mistakes he shouldn't have made. And there was one more thing that wasn't right. The station was equipped with a treadmill for daily exercise, essential in zero gravity to prevent muscle atrophy. But every time the treadmill was used, its vibrations shook Salyut 1's solar panels and antennas, so they chose not to use it. 3 men in space for more than 3 weeks without adequate exercise, in a station that had suffered an electrical fire, with strained interpersonal relationships, and with a fear that never truly went away. On June 24th, after all research targets were met, ground control finally decided to end the mission 6 days early. The news was like a ray of light at the end of a dark tunnel. The cosmonauts began loading their research results into the Soyuz 11 capsule. They laughed, they joked, they could already imagine the soil beneath their feet. They didn't know this would be the last moment they would ever feel happy. June 29, 1971, 6:28 p.m. Moscow time. Dobrovolsky pulled the separation lever. Soyuz 11 detached from Salyut 1 and began the journey toward Earth. Inside the incredibly cramped landing capsule, 3 men sat side by side with minimal gear. The space was too small for 3 people in full-pressure spacesuits, so they didn't wear them. No one asked them to wear protection. There was no protocol requiring it, because all previous missions had always been fine. There was one small thing that happened before separation that wasn't taken seriously at the time. Volkov had trouble closing the hatch of the landing module. With help from ground control, he managed to tighten it just enough to pass the pressure test, enough to pass the test. Soyuz 11 hurtled down. Communication with ground control sounded normal. Procedures went according to schedule. Atmospheric blackout began. This is normal, where radio waves are temporarily cut off due to the heat of air friction. Ground control waited. Inside the capsule, at an altitude of 168 kilometers above the Earth's surface, 6 explosive bolts fired to separate the 3 capsule compartments according to standard procedure. And that was when everything ended. The vibration from the bolt explosion, a vibration that should have been no different from previous missions, shook the landing module hatch that was not perfectly sealed. A ventilation valve opened, not on the ground, not after landing, but at 168 kilometers above Earth, in the unforgiving vacuum of space. In seconds, the air pressure inside the capsule began to freefall, from normal to 0. Patsayev, sitting closest to the valve, felt something was wrong. His ears suddenly hurt immensely. Air felt as if it were being forcibly pulled from his lungs. He turned toward the valve and understood instantly. He tried to close it with his hands. But the Soyuz capsule has 2 ventilation valves. Patsayev only had 2 hands, and the time remaining was no more than 20 seconds. In outer space, explosive decompression doesn't look like it does in the movies. There is no massive explosion, no flames. There is only a silence that suddenly becomes even more silent. Nitrogen in the blood forms bubbles. Lungs collapse. The heart loses its rhythm. The brain stops receiving oxygen. In 12 seconds, a person loses consciousness. In 20 seconds, everything is irreversible. Patsayev was found with the marks of his finger grip still etched on that valve. He fought. Until the very last second, he fought. But Earth was still 168 kilometers below, and there was nothing that could be done. In the Moscow control room, the atmospheric blackout finally ended. The capsule's signal reappeared. All systems were running normally. The parachutes deployed perfectly. The capsule glided down smoothly to the steppes of Kazakhstan. The landing retro rockets fired exactly on time to slow the final velocity. A perfect landing. The recovery team flew in by helicopter, approaching with smiles on their faces. From a distance, everything looked like a successful mission. The capsule was intact. No smoke, no signs of damage. One of the technicians knocked on the capsule door from the outside, as usual, an informal way to let the cosmonauts know they were on the ground. There was no answer. Someone opened the door. Inside, 3 men sat calmly in their seats, eyes closed, perfect posture, as if they were in a deep sleep after a long journey. But not one of them was breathing. The doctors with the recovery team immediately tried resuscitation. For 30 minutes, they did not stop trying. But the cosmonauts had been gone for a long time, dying silently above the sky, long before their capsule touched the ground. The mission that began with the mantle of Soviet pride ended in an inexplicable silence. The Soviet Union suppressed this news for several days before finally being forced to announce it to the world. The investigation found that the Soyuz capsule design at the time was only sufficient for 2 cosmonauts in full pressure suits. But 3 people were squeezed into it, and to fit, the protective suits were discarded. No one seriously questioned that decision because previous missions had always been safe, until they weren't. The Soviet space program halted all manned flights for 2 years. The Soyuz capsule was redesigned from scratch. Seats were reduced from 3 to 2, allowing room for full pressure suits. A new rule was established. No cosmonaut is allowed to enter or leave the capsule without full protection. That rule stands to this day, more than 50 years later. The 3 cosmonauts were buried in the Kremlin wall, the highest honor the Soviet Union could bestow upon its citizens. Their names are carved not just as heroes who succeeded, but as a lesson that must not be forgotten. There is something that cannot leave your mind after knowing this story. 168 kilometers. That was the only distance between them and survival. But far enough to be an unforgiving space. The Soyuz 11 tragedy didn't happen because of gross negligence. No one had malicious intent. No one thought that day would end that way. Everything went according to procedure, a procedure that had never failed before. And that is the most terrifying thing of all. It isn't always the visible failures that kill you. Sometimes what kills you are the assumptions that have been unquestioned for too long, habits that have become too comfortable, a tiny valve that no one thought needed to be checked twice. Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev went to a place where no human had ever set foot before. They paid a price they shouldn't have had to pay. But their names are the reason why everyone who has gone to space after them came home. And that, however painful, remains a legacy.